welcome to faithtalks.com. I'm your host, Mercy Hope, and my guest today is Os Guinness, and I'm very excited that you are joining us today to come into this conversation with us. And Os, I want to back up a few years and find out, first of all, how long have you walked with the Lord?
50 years now.
That's awesome. Can you just share with us, how did you come to know him?
Well, before me, I'm descended from the youngest son of the famous Irish brewer who came to Christ through John Wesley and built in Christian generosity and social responsibility into the heart of the Guinness brewery 250 odd years ago. And so my side of the family has kept the faith ever since. My grandfather went as a missionary doctor to China, and my mother was a missionary doctor in China, and I was born there. So I have a strong Christian heritage behind me. But when the communists took over in 1949, I was allowed to escape, and I went back to England, and my parents were under house arrest for another 3 years. So I didn't actually have their influence at all in my teenage years, and I was at an English boarding school. So coming to faith was partly through a Christian friend and partly through reading. And I read, on the one hand, Nietzsche and Sartre and Camus, the great atheists, and on the other hand, people like Pascal, Dostoevsky, G.K. Chesterton, and C.S. Lewis. And I was finally convinced that the Christian faith was true.
Yes. But
actually what really was revolutionary in my life, obviously conversion is the most important thing. But a few years later, when I went out to the L'Abri community in Switzerland under Francis Schaeffer, that was mind-exploding to me. The idea you could think Christianly about the whole of life. That is what made a huge impact in my life.
Wow, I am so glad I asked. That's an amazing heritage and background. So what actually then brought you or your family to the United States?
I came over in 1984. I've been here many times, and I grew up in China with Americans, so Americans have been part of my life ever since I was a boy. But I came over in 84. Oh, actually in 79, I came over for the BBC to do a documentary on the influence of the religious right, moral majority and so on, in Reagan's election. And I wrote that up for the BBC Director General. And out of that came the idea for a book. So I came here for 6 months to do some research on the book, and I'm still here. No, at the end of that time, we were about to go back and had a real conviction, the only time in my life where I literally audibly heard the voice of the Lord. Wow. So we're here.
That's a good reason. I think when he speaks that way, you have to
take it seriously.
You have to take it seriously. So, I mean, we're very glad that you stayed. I know that you've written over 30 books, so it's hard to isolate just a couple of your works. But I would like to highlight your book, The Call, because as I have talked with friends and family members leading up to this interview, that's the book that so many people have said, I read The Call, and it changed my life, or I read The Call and was so impacted by that. And so can you tell us a little bit about, for people that are not familiar with that book, or who are, but what your heart passion was going into that project? It was obviously very anointed and used of God.
You could introduce it a whole number of ways. I would say calling is theologically and culturally the most powerful Christian truth, maybe second to the cross, that has shaped history. In other words, it's not just a little private belief, but something that's dynamism in people's lives. And it's been incredibly covered over today with neglect and confusion. So when I came to Christ, and it's partly personal, it was understood, if you're all out for Jesus, you're a missionary or a minister or an evangelist, and you had the big three options. And I actually knew that my parents were missionaries, so I wasn't cut out for that. And too long, but I had a comic attempt to be an evangelist, which we haven't time for. And so I went, well, I'll just tell you briefly, it was the heyday of Billy Graham in England. And so I accepted an invitation to speak at a church in Northern Ireland. And unbeknownst to me, that was the capital of Ian Paisley's extreme conservative Protestant Orange Order, Ballymena. And the first evening I read from the Revised Standard Version, which was one of the common things that was not the King James. And the locals were so shocked, Ian Paisley's people, they picketed the church every night with about 100 people with placards, and so no one could get into the mission, and it was a comic fiasco. Now that's a long time ago.
Wow.
So then I went to a church wondering if I was called to the ministry. The last of the big three left. And I loved the people, but I hated it. And there was a time I had a 40-year-old car, and I took it to the local garage. You had to crank it. And the man who put gas in the tank, I talked to him for about 20 minutes and realized he was the first non-Christian I'd spoken to in months. And I realized why I hated for me, the church. I'm not the gifts of a pastor. It was a kind of womb-to-tomb subculture. And I loved being out engaging the world, films and philosophy and all sorts of things.
Yes.
And I realized that was not me. Then, out of frustration, someone introduced me to a 16th century manuscript on calling. And it was the liberation for me. And from then onwards, I've spoken on it. Eventually, I wrote on it. And it's unquestionably my biggest selling book.
Yes. Oh, amazing. I feel like we could sit here all day and I could listen to stories. This is really fun. I'm holding right now your latest title. And
We'll turn it the other way around.
of course. But then I can't read it. Oh, practical minds here. So, Free People's Suicide. But to nutshell this book, I feel is going to be a challenge, and the concepts in this book, because I think for many of us right now who are looking at the United States and where we are in history, it's a little overwhelming, to put it mildly. But talk about what is going on in your heart and mind, and obviously you have a heart for this country, and talk about that. Talk about this book. And
well, the title goes back to Abraham Lincoln, who said, as a nation of free men, either we will live free for all time or die by suicide. In other words, strong, free people bring themselves down. The idea, though, not the title, the idea goes back to St. Augustine, who said if you want to understand a nation, put his idea in modern terms, you don't look at its population or the size of the army or the strength of the research universities. You look at what he called loved things held in common. What do a people love supremely? And if that's a good thing, the nation can be good. And if it's healthy or unhealthy, the nation can be healthy or unhealthy. Now, obviously, what is America's supreme love? Freedom. No question. You know, Jefferson called this an empire of liberty. And obviously, Americans pride themselves on freedom. But here's the point. The framers well understood that freedom never lasts. And the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom, which is why it always brings itself down. And so the framers built in antidotes to try and keep it sustainable. But here's the argument. Modern Americans have abandoned their system, often through neglect, sometimes through open dismissal and scorn. So I would argue that modern American freedom is unsustainable. And this is the deepest crisis of America, a crisis of freedom. Lincoln called the Civil War a freedom war. Now, as the North and the South had two different concepts of freedom. And in a way, what we call today the culture wars is the second freedom wars. And you can see very different ideas of freedom on either side.
yes. So, without giving away all of the content of the book, and because of time, obviously, we can't do that. But my question is, without giving away the whole thing here, first of all, do you see hope? And secondly, for there to be hope and for our future, for our freedom and liberty, what are some action steps that American citizens need to take?
Well, leave the action steps for a second. Is there hope?
Okay. Yes.
The framers were really clear that America needs a return to first things, constantly. They compared themselves, interestingly, with the Jews and the Puritans. In other words, what for the Jews the Old Testament calls a return. A return to God and God's return to the Jews.
Okay.
What the Puritans called that revival or Reformation, returning to the way of Jesus.
Right.
Well, the framers had their own version. So you had a very conservative framer, like, say, George Mason, who talked about the need for a frequent recurrence to fundamental first principles. You need to keep going back, or you're in trouble. Thomas Jefferson, who was much more deist and highly liberal, even he talked about the need for a revolution every 20 years. In other words, every new generation is a new people. Unless they buy in again, all over again, you'll eventually drift from the roots and you'll be another people. And so, quite definitely, but what we need is leadership with vision and boldness and articulateness to say to Americans, this is our system, the American experiment. This is what it means. We need to go back to the best of the framers. In other words, today, you think of the framers' view, say, of slaves, or the framers' view of women, or Native Americans. The trouble is their blind spots have taken over the picture of the framers, and many modern Americans have thrown out the baby, the bathwater, and all.
Sure.
Whereas I think you need to say these things were wrong, attitudes to slaves and so on.
Right.
But these things were terrific, and they haven't been improved on. And so, modern Americans are free to say we don't like the framers' system. We don't like the framers even. But then they've got to say, what have we put in its place that does what the framers saw needed doing? And the fact is, Americans today don't even understand the framers, what they were trying to do, let alone put anything solid in its place. So the country's in trouble. But there are certain things, you take action steps. Take one. One thing that's very practical that could be done easily in 5 years, restore civic education. It used to be understood that in a free country, everybody's born free, not everyone's worthy of freedom. They had to be educated for liberty, which is called liberal or civic education. In other words, you teach people what it means to be a citizen. And that was, you take the American motto, the unum that balances the pluribus, the unity that balances the diversity. Now that's, since the 1960s, gone. It's gone in public schools, it's gone all over the place, so there's no American unum today. There's no core, there's no unity. Now that could be put right with vision and leadership coming from Washington or elsewhere. There are certain very practical things that could be done.
Do you outline those in this book as well?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And the book ends with hope. If people wake up to the moment and seize the moment.
Yes, absolutely.
But this I've long believed, the 20th century was called the American century. Henry Luce in 1941. My earlier book is called The American Hour, on the biblical sense of kairos. There's an hour that's part crisis, part opportunity. You miss it, it'll lead to deeper crisis and maybe disaster. If you seize it, you can go on to better moments. And I think we're towards the end of the American hour. We haven't got long. I was with a congressman last week who said he didn't believe America even had 5 years. I don't think it's quite that bad. But we're very close to the end of what I call the American hour, a moment of opportunity which, if not taken, will lead down to crisis.
So the if in your statement is really one of the biggest words, those two small letters, that really is that, in a sense, it's in the hands of the people.
That's right, and not Washington. It used to be understood, say, with Athens and Rome, that Athens was the Athenians. There was no state apart from Athens. And in the same way, America is the Americans today. And it's the American people that have got to wake up, got to think, pray, act, and do what it takes to put it right.
Yes. And now just in closing, to to reach out and speak with our international viewers, because we are being watched by people from all over the world, and what I like to call the Lord's generation, not a certain age, or not an American or a Canadian or Australian, but the Lord's generation. If you had just a word of encouragement or admonition for the Lord's generation, what would you like to leave us with today?
Well, I was born in China, and I've lived on 3 continents, so I'm not
Yes.
American now.
Right.
So I very much appreciate the audience you reach out
Yes.
to. You know, if we think you're looking at faith, there are 3 grand global tasks we're facing. One is to prepare the global south. The gospel is exploding across the global south, sub-Saharan Africa, China, where I was born, but most of the global south is pre-modern. What's done in the church in the West is captivity to the advanced modern world. In other words, the challenge is coming to the global south, and we've got to say, be prepared. Don't do what we did in the West. That's one huge challenge. The second challenge is to win back the West. Many Western Christians are gloomy and decline-oriented.
Sure,
No.
sure.
If you think we are the product of 2 earlier missions to the West. The first was the conversion of Rome. Incredible. But after the collapse of the Western Empire in Rome, much of the Western Church collapsed, and you had the Dark Ages. And the second mission to the West was the conversion of the barbarian kingdoms through Irish missionaries and others. And we're living at the twilight of that. But instead of crisis and gloom and doom, we need to think this is the time for a third mission to the West. Win back the US, win back Canada, win back Australia, win back Europe over the next 100, 150 years. That's the second task. The third great task is for Christians to contribute to the global future. So put simply, Christians are magnificent, second to none, in fighting evils. Slavery, all sorts of things. Wherever
Sure.
there's an egregious evil,
Yes.
Christians have been in the forefront of the fight. But we're not so good at thinking constructively about some of the big questions that aren't obviously evil. For example, the nature of capitalism, or one that I'm passionately interested in. How in a global era do we live with deep differences in this emerging global public square, including the internet?
Sure.
We've got to figure out answers to these things for the whole world's sake, and show that in Christ we don't just fight against wrongs, but we can dream dreams and see
Yes.
visions and really contribute to a possibility for human flourishing
Yes.
in the future. So those to me are the grand tasks for people of faith right across the whole world to be a part of.
Yes, that is a fabulous final word, and one that I am very, very excited about and very passionate about. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your vision with us. We are really grateful that you took the time.
Oh, my pleasure, Mercy.
And thank you for watching today.